In Oprah's recent podcast, she talked about the topic going no contact. And people had a lot of thoughts. Many people were pissed off. A lot of people felt vindicated or like someone finally spoke for them. Either way, a lot of chatter online. And so much so that they turned off the comments on the YouTube channel or the YouTube video about it. Found that interesting. But let's get into it. The main gripe people had was that they called going no contact a trend or a growing phenomenon. And I vehemently disagree with this because visibility does not equal popularity. Just because people are talking about this online more doesn't mean that it wasn't going on before. People often just suffered in silence thinking they were the only one. And this is honestly the beautiful part about social media is that it lets us find people who are going through the same thing as us and reminds us we're not alone. And we can also get some peer support and understanding. And overall, I think it helps us process the pain of going no contact in a more healthy way. So there's that piece, okay? Calling it a trend, I think was a bad take. However, overall, I liked the podcast and I thought it was a good conversation. Now, if you're new to this terminology, going no contact is just like it sounds. It means that we are estranged from some member of our family. In this case, they talk mostly about parents, but it means we don't text, we don't call, we don't see them, we don't attend family events if they're going to be there. We have zero contact with them. And the shocking thing to me was that Oprah, when she opens the podcast, talks about how 1/3 of people are estranged from at least one member of their family. And that sounds like a huge number because it is. But the piece of it that I feel like wasn't really addressed and kind of frustrated me is how common abuse is. I know from being online and talking to all of you since 2011, also working in my private practice and in a hospital setting, I know, unfortunately, how common trauma is. And Oprah uses this term that we have an expanded view of what constitutes trauma. And that also I found to be offensive because to say that we have an expanded view, the way I interpreted it, and I don't know if this is the way that she meant it, but the way that I interpreted that phrase was that she's trying to say that people think things are abuse when they're not. And I would argue that in most cases, at least from my experience as a therapist and talking to all of you, is that it is really difficult for most of us, I'd say 90% of the people I talk to, for us to admit that what happened to us was in fact a trauma, especially when it comes at the hands of our parents. That can be so foundation shaking, right? It can be really hard for us to say that. And so I didn't like that she kind of attached that to no contact, saying that we have this view of what trauma, this expanded view of what trauma looks like, and that's kind of why people are going no contact. But hang in here, because I do agree with some of the points that you might not like. I also definitely agree with some of the points maybe you do. But let's start off by talking about the decision to go no contact, because what they talked about most in this podcast was how this coming around to that decision is a difficult one. And all of the people who talked about it, all the adult children who have made that choice, talked about how hard it was for them and how they had tried and tried again to have a relationship with their parents, and in the end decided that they just couldn't communicate with them. And one woman, I think, beautifully described it by saying that it was being bled out by 1,000 cuts. And I've heard other people in our community call it death by 1,000 cuts. And what that really means is that when we have to disconnect from our parents, it's not one event that causes it. A lot of the parents in the audience thought that was the case. I don't agree. It's not one event. It's a pattern of behavior over our entire lives usually. And this can mean that, we were raised a certain way, and there was one woman that's like, I already knew I wouldn't have a good relationship with them because I think she was abused growing up, is what she alluded to. But for a lot of the other people that spoke, it was when they became adults and they got into their own therapy because their relationships or their life, their career wasn't going so well. It was only then that they realized how toxic or abusive their upbringing was. And I'll speak personally that I didn't even realize the fact that we didn't argue in my family. Growing up, I never really saw my parents fight. My mom will even share that, I wasn't even comfortable with her and my dad having a disagreement. If they raised their voices at all, I'd be like, no, don't fight. I hated it, super uncomfortable around it, never saw it happen. Therefore, when I got older and found myself in therapy, I realized that I wasn't comfortable with conflict. And so instead of trying to have a discussion or even an argument, I couldn't. And if the argument took place, then I didn't know how to repair. So I'd be like, well, that relationship is over. And as bad as that sounds, I did that a lot. Friendships, boyfriends, all sorts of different relationships in my life. I didn't know how to fight and make up. And it wasn't until probably my late 20s, mid to late 20s, that I started to attempt that and tried to figure it out. How could I argue, disagree, fight with somebody, and then come back together? How could I do that? And I know some of you out there might be like, I can't believe that, Katie. That's wild. But that's my experience, right? That's how hard it is. That's because I was raised in that certain environment. I didn't know how to do that. And for those of us who decide to go no contact, we're raised in one environment, we grow up, we realize how toxic it is, and then we try to fix it. And this is where I feel it's even more painful for people. And what I've heard from a lot of you is it's and what I've heard from so many of you is that it's in that time, right, when you're in therapy and you're working on yourself, you realize how toxic it is, then you reach out to your parent to try to better the relationship. This could mean that you try boundaries. You might say like, hey mom, I don't really like, you texting me like that. It kind of feels manipulative, or it kind of feels passive aggressive. Or you might say like, dad, I don't want to communicate with you if you've been drinking. That's really hard for me. We might try to lay some of these kind of rules down, these healthy boundaries. And it's in that process that we begin to see just how deep the toxicity runs. A parent can lash out, you're so ungrateful, I can't believe you'd say that, right? We can get some of this backlash from it. And that's when we pull back. We aren't sure how to go forward. And as we try and retreat and try again, we get more and more harmed. And then essentially what ends up happening is, at a last resort, usually there is one last event that happens. We decide that we need to go no contact. And in most cases, I don't know if you guys would agree with this too, but in most cases, what I've seen in my practice and heard from a lot of you is that this no contact kind of goes in and out as we hope that we can improve the relationship. So we might go no contact for a couple of years, only to try again later to see if we can finally, make amends and things could improve. I have my notes. Let's not forget anything. And so those are some of the reasons. I think it's more foundational. It's more pattern driven. It's not a trend. It's not something we do willy-nilly. It's not one event that causes us to go no contact. It's a pattern. And so I think that's one thing that I really want to drive home, is that if you have gone no contact, you know this to be true. But if you're a parent or a sibling or someone who is estranged from someone else and doesn't want to be, at least take a moment to consider the patterns of behavior that you have in your relationships and how that might affect those around you, okay? Now, the biggest piece, and what I hope is our key learning from this entire conversation, is about conflict resolution. Because I have a note here that estrangement and going no contact has a lot to do with how we handle conflict, and how a lot of us don't have conflict resolution skills. Like I just stated, I grew up in a family where we didn't argue. I didn't know how to fight and come back together. I didn't have conflict resolution skills. And from the parents' side, so the ones that were estranged, they talked a lot about how they didn't know why their children went no contact. They felt like all of a sudden they just stopped responding. And that was the hardest part for them. That was the thing that was the most painful. And there was one woman that was particularly agitated. I could feel the anger from her when she was talking about the situation. And so I just want to say this, that if we are considering going no contact, I really want us, as the people considering going no contact, to at least attempt to communicate the reason. And I know you might be saying, Katie, I've already tried with them. I've tried with them for years. Let's at least try to communicate it one last time. Because it was that not knowing that left the parents feeling like they did not know how to make it better. And there was one gentleman, I loved his story, because his daughter went no contact. He didn't understand. There was no communication. And she reached out because she needed something. He was like, well, that's my baby. I'm always going to pick up the phone. And she told him, why. She said he was a helicopter parent, and she really just wanted him to let her be independent. She's grown. She's like 23. And then she said, Dad, why don't we go to therapy? And he went. And that is a very important decision because his ability or his openness to going to therapy is what healed their relationship. And so what I want to say to both sides, to the people who are considering going no contact or are no contact, does the parent, do you think, know why? Okay? Have you communicated that? And then to the parents who are estranged, if you're watching this, have you been able to at least consider your role in this conflict? Now, yes, on the other side, we also need to consider our role in this conflict. But I found that to be the biggest issue, is that we, as the ones going no contact, were not communicating our reason behind it. So the parents really didn't know. They felt blindsided. And then they felt angry because they didn't know what to do. They're like, I'm just in timeout. Like, that's not fair. So are we communicating? And then parents, if you are, excommunicated, you feel you're estranged and you're upset about it, have you considered your role? Okay? Because overall, through this whole podcast, I have all these notes because I thought that the willingness to self-reflect, I have a little asterisk here. I'm like, our willingness to self-reflect is the key to healing. Now, I know that some of us have parents or family that's incredibly abusive. If it's dangerous for you to try to re-engage, I'm not asking you to do that. But if you think, hey, for so many years, we actually had a decent relationship, might have been predicated on me giving in to their will, but could I maybe try to find a way in between? Or could I at least acknowledge my role in this conflict, parents and children alike? Because it's in that ability to self-reflect that I think we can find a path forward. And that was the real takeaway for me. But the piece that really, I think, pissed everybody off is kind of acting like going no contact is a trend, that it's not a big deal, and that it's done to talk about on the internet. And that is the therapist in me can't not at least talk about the ripple effects of going no contact and why this would never be something that we would do for attention. When we go no contact, when we stop seeing a parent, if that's a decision that we have to make, let's say we've tried to self-reflect, we've tried to communicate with our parent, they aren't able to apologize, to own up, they aren't being self-reflective, they're very defensive. I wish you'd just leave the past in the past. Just forget about this. I can't believe you. You're so ungrateful after all I've done for you, right? We can hear that kind of messaging. If that's the response that we get and we decide to go no contact, the thing that I don't feel people talk enough about is the grief. And when I shared this on TikTok, I got a ton of comments about, yes, it's like grieving not only the relationship that we wished we had, but also we're grieving someone who's still alive. I'm grieving the loss of my mother or my father. And it's incredibly painful. A woman in the audience of the for Oprah's podcast said, she asked a question of the therapist, and it really even makes me get a little choked up now. She said, my parents were incredibly abusive, and I knew I wouldn't have a relationship with them. But when I see someone in the park or at the mall or in the grocery store with their mom, I feel this ache, and I really just wish that I could have had that. And she asked them, like, will that go away? I was like, oof. And the short answer is no. For any of you who have ever experienced grief, whether through actual death, like losing a person, or loss of relationship, you know that grief doesn't go away. Our life really just grows around it so that the grief doesn't feel as big as it used to. And so the therapist essentially says that like it'll still be there, but it will, dissipate with time, which is kind of, is true. And that's the piece that I think is really important for anybody out there who thinks it's a trend, who thinks that this is something people do just because they want to talk about it online. No. Try to put yourself in that position. Imagine being in a relationship so incredibly painful that the only option you feel you have is to not talk to them ever again. And this isn't somebody who's like a casual person in your life. This is a parent. This is a sibling. This is somebody you've known your whole life, and you're not going to talk to them. Imagine that feeling. Imagine having to make that choice. Do you know how far you have to have been pushed to make that choice? And then imagine that ache, that grief, that especially when we're children and it's a parent, we can feel like we have a gaping hole where the parent was supposed to be. And I've talked about this forever, how we can go out into the world then trying to fill that hole with someone else. And unfortunately, that's just not how the healing works. I mean, that's a whole nother video, but inner child work and therapy, we have to heal that wound ourselves. And yes, I know that sucks, but all of that, the grief and the wound and the healing of that void is what we are signing up for when we say we're going no contact. And it's a really hard and heavy decision. And so I want everybody to know that it's never taken lightly. It's a big choice, and it's done because we can't keep essentially lighting ourselves on fire for someone else. I always talk about lighting yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. For many of us, if we grew up in a toxic or harmful environment, we felt like we had to act a certain way, do a certain thing to make our parent happy. And that really meant we abandoned ourselves. And so when we get older and we feel a little bit more independent, we realize who we are. We can't go back to that person. We don't want to do that anymore. And so when we say we don't want to do it, or we just are acting in a different way, we're met with aggression, we're met with frustration, we're met with manipulation. And no matter what we do, we can't seem to get it right. And so it's a really heavy and big decision. And to call it a trend or to say that someone would do it for attention is just honestly like piling on the trauma, piling on the misunderstanding, and really stigmatizing something that we've only just recently decided is okay to talk about. And that's really what bothered me the most. To be fair and balanced, I also want to address the parents out there who have been estranged, because I think the nice thing that Oprah did in this podcast is allow space for both. Because if we know anything, we know that in order to have greater understanding, and also for some of us to be able to heal those relationships, we have to be able to have these difficult conversations. And she opens by saying, I hope we can make, heart space for this. And so I hope that you will hold heart space as we give some space for those who have been estranged and are having a really hard time with it, because there were a lot of parents who felt really wounded. And the biggest piece is that if we are, as the adult children, are considering going no contact, we need to let them know why. Whether that's through email, text, a voicemail, or in person, whatever. If it's safe, again, not asking anyone to ever re-engage with an abusive relationship. But if we feel slighted, if we feel misunderstood, if we feel like our parents just so toxic and they don't really get us, cutting them off and not communicating doesn't give your parent anything to do. And imagine if you had a child and they don't want to have contact with you. Imagine what that pain could feel like. We talked about that ache from the girl who was like, I see someone with their mom out at the park and it aches. The same goes for parents. That father who has now, gone to therapy and has recultivated his relationship with his daughter, he talked about the pain that he felt and he didn't know why. And his daughter never communicated until she needed something from him. And honestly, that's on her. She lost out on, I want to say it was like 3 years with her dad, when if she had communicated and said, hey dad, I think you're helicoptery and I really would like to get in therapy so we can figure this out, that he would have done it. I'm not saying it's easy to have those conversations, but for the parents that feel estranged and don't know why, I do believe they're owed an explanation. People can't fix what they don't understand. I talk about all the time how we have to do these inventories of self so that we can become better tomorrow, right? How can our parent be doing that if we haven't told them what they're doing wrong? And I don't mean, well, they should know. If that's what comes into your head, oh, they should know. No one's a mind reader. And a lot of times there was one of the professionals that Oprah had on said something beautifully. He said, a lot of times the adult children feel like, well, it's obvious. They should know. And the parents that are being cut off are like, I don't understand. I did everything like my parents did. And he goes, and the generations are talking past one another. And so I want to challenge everybody out there. If you are no contact, if you're considering going no contact, I want you to take a minute to consider if they know why you did it. Or if you know. I want you also to maybe journal, like get out your journal and maybe write down a couple questions, because I really think it's important for us to reflect either before or even while we are no contact to make sure it's still a good decision for us, okay? Because like I said, it's a painful one to make, and we can have that grief and that ache and even that guilt, like you only get one mother, but it's like you didn't feel like you had a mother already, It's a very complex situation. And so I want us to take some time to reflect, to make sure that we are what's the word I'm looking for? It's almost like I want to make sure that we're doing our due diligence so that when we make this decision or we continue to decide to stay no contact, that we're doing what's best for us. Okay? So ask yourself, did I communicate why I went no contact? And you can also put in there, is it safe to communicate that? That's fair. Totally fair. But then also, do you know why you needed that distance for yourself? Maybe remind yourself of why, because sometimes we can forget, and I don't want any of us getting manipulated and pulled back into abusive situations. It's important to reflect. If you're the parent, you need to be doing this internal work too, because the next one is for everybody, is what could I have done differently that could have improved the relationship on both sides? I want both of you to do this. We have to think about it because we each have a role. Asking your child to eat crow because they're the ones that cut off contact and you're the adult and you deserve respect is never going to get you the relationship back. And being an adult child and never telling your parent what is upsetting you and being honest about your role in that situation or that behavior is also not going to get that relationship back. Okay. And I know some of you might be like, I'm not looking for that relationship. That's fair. I just think it's important that we do this reflective work because, again, my key takeaway, I'm reading from my notes, says willingness to self-reflect is the key. And so if you are in this situation and you don't want to be in it, self-reflect. And maybe see if your parent or child will self-reflect as well. And therapy is something I cannot recommend enough. And I also want to just finish with, if you are a parent out there and you're estranged from all of your children, I cannot encourage you enough to get into therapy to figure out why. Because the only thing they have in common is you. And I know you might think like they're being so disrespectful and they're so hurtful. What happened? What behavior have you displayed that could have been hurtful to them? And I know you might not think it's bad. You're like, I did the best I could. I'm not saying that you didn't, but there's something there. And if we don't reflect, then it's not going to improve. And berating them or yelling at them or trying to send passive aggressive texts or manipulative memes isn't going to get you what you want. You're going to have to figure out what might have happened. Because if they're not going to tell you, I'm not saying that you can read their mind, but we can at least self-reflect so that we can be better tomorrow. Because even if they don't decide to communicate, it will improve your marriage, your friendships, and any other relationship you might have. And I think those are all my thoughts. I'd love to know yours. Did you listen to the full podcast? Because I have to tell you, I listened to clips and I had a whole different view until I listened to the whole thing through, actually twice, to take all of my notes. Because I do think this going no contact is something that's being talked about more, which is great. It's something a lot of people felt shame and guilt about for years and not being able to share. But I do think that there needs to be more conversation about conflict resolution, because if we've gone no contact because of, I don't know, something that could have been communicated better. And if you're out there and you're no contact and you're like, if my parent just said sorry, it would all be better, then I think that's something we should maybe see if we could work towards, right? That's actually a really great goal. And that means that the going no contact isn't something you want to do forever. You actually see a path forward. That's the path. Maybe we can see how we can make that happen. But again, willingness to self-reflect is the key. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack when it comes to this conversation. I don't want anybody to feel left out. So let me know what you think in the comments. Are you no contact? Have you gone no contact? Or has your child cut you off? Let me know your thoughts. I'd love to keep talking about this because, again, we have to be able to have these tough conversations. We can't only go into the void and talk about one side or the other. Then we're only going to get people that support our point of view. And we really need to be challenged to see other points of view if we're ever going to make this better. Because I know from the people in my audience who have been no contact, it's a very painful experience. Like I said, it's a big decision. And if there's any chance of reconciliation, we want to take that chance, right? Again, not abusive situations, but if all you're looking for is your parent to say sorry, which I know is sometimes a big ask, but if that's what we're looking for and that would make it all better, maybe that's something we work towards. Maybe that's a goal that we have. Maybe we see if they'll go to therapy with us. I don't know. Sometimes extending that olive branch just one last time could be what brings the relationship back together. Maybe not, but maybe. I hope you found this helpful. At least we can have this conversation, right? We need to be able to talk about these difficult topics. And remember, willingness to self-reflect is the key. Have a wonderful week, and I'll see you next time.